Hello, my name is Alejandro Jenkins. I'm a professor of physics at the University of Costa Rica. A couple of weeks ago, I gave a talk to an audience mostly of undergraduate physics students on the same subject, but now I'm sitting down to record this on my computer in English to upload this to my YouTube channel, where hopefully it'll be a bit more widely available. The title of the talk is The Artifice of Sadi Carnot, Reflections on His 230th Birthday. Sadi Carnot is widely regarded as the founder of modern thermodynamics, and he was born on the 1st of June, 1796. I had originally intended to give this talk closer to the 1st of June, but various other responsibilities made this impossible. So I'm recording this now on the 19th of July. I've divided this talk into four parts. First, the mechanics of engines. Then in the second part, we'll introduce our title character, Sadi Carnot. I've titled him here Capitaine du Génie, which sounds like Captain of Genius, but what it actually means is that he was a captain in the Corps of Engineers of the French Army. And the third part, which I've titled Carnot's Artifice, I will try to summarize what I regard as the most important, most significant aspects of Carnot's theoretical work. And then in section 4, which I've titled Active Forces, I will try to connect this to my own current research interests in non-equilibrium thermodynamics and in the dynamics of active systems. So there will be a lot of history in this talk, and perhaps even a bit of philosophy. But I'm neither a historian nor a philosopher of science. I'm a theoretical physicist, and my interest is really in what we can learn from this story for our use right now in physics, in theoretical physics. And here I take my cue from an idea due to Hasuk Chang, who's a professor of history and philosophy of science at the University of Cambridge, who some years ago wrote an article with this stimulating title, History and Philosophy of Science as a Continuation of Science by Other Means. And this is really very much the attitude that I try to bring to this subject. So let's begin with the mechanics of engines. And I would like to begin with one historical engine, which is known in Spanish as the Artificio de Juanello. Juanello is the name given in Spain to Gianello de la Torre, who was an Italian-born inventor and engineer. He spent most of his career in Toledo, city in central Spain. And one of the things that he built, which was this so-called Artifice of Juanello, was a device for raising water from the river Tajo, which goes around the city of Toledo, up to a reservoir in the uppermost point of the city, in the fortress of the Alcázar. And from there, the water could descend just by the action of gravity to wherever it could be put to use. This device we would modernly call an engine. At the time, the word that was used in Spanish was artificio. In English, the cognate would be artifice. So the word engine, evidently, well, it's closely connected to engineer and engineering, but it comes from the concept of an ingenious, clever contrivance built in order to do some task. Interestingly, in Spanish, we say for ingeniero, we say ingeniero is engineer and ingeniería is engineering. But ingenio, which would be the natural cognate of engine, is only used for what in English would be called an engine in one very specific context. So we talk about an ingenio azucarero for a sugar mill. A sugar mill is an engine. But more broadly, for instance, when we teach thermodynamics in English, we talk about heat engines in order to describe what as a device that uses an external disequilibrium between something that's hot and something that's cold in order to do useful work in a cyclical way. The same concept in Spanish we call usually máquina de calor, so just heat machine, even though machine, of course, is a much broader concept. So we speak about simple machines like levers and inclined planes and screws and so forth, which are not engines in the sense in which the word is used today. So what do I mean by an engine? So, okay, so, well, here's So the remains of Juanelo's Artifice has been in ruins for a while, for centuries now, and only bits of it remain. So reconstructing exactly how it worked is it's a little bit of guesswork. But here's a reconstruction based on the work of an Italian historian of engineering, Ladislao Reti. But the central idea was that the current of the river turned a large wheel, and this wheel in turn moved various bits of machinery that raised water in stages from the riverbed up to the reservoir in the fortress of the Alcázar. And the important thing, what makes this an engine in the modern sense, is that as long as the wheel was turning, this this device could keep doing its job of racing water against gravity and filling up the reservoir. So this is what we mean nowadays by an engine, at least in the context in which I'll be using the term. So it's a device that can do useful work over and over again, repeatedly or cyclically. And well, so one of the things that I wanted to illustrate by mentioning this Artifice of Juanelo from the 16th century is that this kind of engines have existed for a while. So they became increasingly popular in the Renaissance, but I believe they're even older. And one of the things that you could use with the water, you could do with the water that has been raised by an engine like this uh, one of the less useful but perhaps more monumental things that you can do is to make a jet for a fountain. And this was actually very popular in the Renaissance, especially among monarchs. So Louis XIV in Versailles had created a very impressive set of monumental fountains. And Frederick II, the King of Prussia, widely known as Frederick the Great, had been building up his own palace in Potsdam outside of Berlin. The palace is called Sans Souci, which is French for without worries. And one of the things that Frederick wanted in order to compete with the prestige of the court and the palace in Versailles was to build a sufficiently impressive fountain in his gardens. Uh, but it turns out that this project, so nowadays you can, this is a modern picture, you can go there and you'll find a nice fountain in the middle of the garden. But it turns out that when Frederick originally tried to do this in the 18th century, the mid 18th century, this project was a failure. And one of the people that he blamed for the failure of this fountain project, very interestingly, is this man, Leonhard Euler. Euler was widely regarded as the most important of all modern mathematicians, and also a very significant theoretical physicist, as I'll emphasize more in a bit. He's the father of analytical mechanics, which we still teach to physics students in university. And Euler, so to say his dates, he was born in 1707 in Basel, Switzerland, where he was also educated. But when he tried to get a teaching position at the University of Basel, he was not successful. So they ended up having to emigrate to St. Petersburg in Russia, where Tsar Peter the Great had established a new Academy of Sciences. And he worked there for a number of years. But there was a change of regime, and the new authorities became less and less friendly towards the foreign academicians. So Euler ended up leaving Russia and settling in Berlin, where Frederick Great, Frederick II, King of Prussia, very much an enlightened monarch, was setting up his own Academy of Sciences. But it turns out one of the things that Frederick wanted from his foreign academics was help with this fountain project. And later, Frederick complained bitterly to his good friend Voltaire, the French enlightened philosopher. In a letter, he says, I wished to make a fountain in my garden. The Cyclops Euler calculated the effort of the wheels to raise the water to a pond from which it was to descend by canals to make the jet at Sans Souci. Frederick refers to Euler as Cyclops because Euler had lost an eye due to an infection early on. And later he would go entirely blind, but this didn't slow him down at all. He's by far the most prolific mathematical scientist in history. I think they've been publishing his collected works for something like 100 years now. But then Frederick goes on to say in this letter to Voltaire, my mill was built mathematically and could not raise a single drop of water to within 50 feet of the pond. Vanity of vanities, vanity of mathematics. So Frederick was very much not pleased with Euler's contribution to this fountain project. And I was aware of this story. I might have even repeated it in class for laughs. But a few years ago, I became curious about the details. So I looked this up online, and I found that there was a relatively recent literature by a German historian of science, Michael Eckert, who specializes in fluid dynamics. And Eckert very much wants to defend Euler from what he terms Frederick's libel. So according to Eckert, really, it was not Euler's fault that this project failed. It failed because Frederick was too stingy and hired incompetent technicians in order to work on the parts of this fountain project. And this is one of several articles that Eckert has written on the subject. But reading it carefully, it struck me that there was something which I think is very significant that Eckert misses, which is how does, okay, so I forgot to say that one of the main points that Eckert makes is that Euler actually published a number of papers at around the time that he was working on this fountain project on the problem of computing how much pressure is needed to raise water against gravity up some arbitrarily shaped pipe. And Euler arrives at this equation, and Eckert shows that this can be interpreted modernly, basically as Bernoulli's theorem with a term which corresponds to how much work is being done on the water by the action of a piston. But what I think is quite significant and has been missed by Eckert here is that this is the way in which Euler in these papers conceptualizes the pump. So he describes what he computes is the force that should push down on a piston for that piston to squeeze the water out of a cylinder and up through the pipe to a certain height. And in this equation, so the force that has to push down on the piston is represented in terms of the height, little k, of an imaginary column of water whose weight would be acting downward on the piston. And I believe in this equation, W sub P is the speed with which the piston is moving down. So this is absolutely not how a hydraulic pump actually works in practice. So the setup would only be pumping water up as long as the piston is moving downwards. And then at some point, right, the piston would come to the bottom of the cylinder, and then here somebody would have to raise it in order to make it available for the next course of pumping. So it's really a one-shot device. And what happens in real life is that hydraulic pumps have either pistons that oscillate up and down or turbines that go around and around, and then they're capable of pumping water up cyclically and therefore repeatedly over and over again. So as long as the piston is oscillating or the wheel is turning, then work is being done in the form of the raising of the water against gravity. So that means that in the sense in which I defined a moment ago, that a hydraulic pump is an engine, and Euler is very much not treating the pump as an engine. He's treating this as a one-shot device in which the water is being pushed upward by the action of the weight of this imaginary column of water. But I think this is very understandable that Euler would have approached the problem in this way, because Euler, as I'll emphasize more in a moment, is the founder of analytical mechanics. And an actual engine lies outside of the scope of analytical mechanics. So really, within the framework, the mental framework in which Euler was working, this is basically the best that he could do. Of course, you could think of this as his calculation as an effective calculation of how much pressure needs to be exerted by the parts of the pump in order to drive up the water, but it's not a realistic description of how a pump actually works. So it doesn't surprise me that Euler would not have turned out to have made a useful contribution to to Frederick's project of building the fountain. On the other hand, we know, as we said before, that engines that raised water, hydraulic pumps, had existed for a long time, had been deployed very successfully in various places, including Toledo and Versailles under Louis XIV and so forth. But the problem was that this knowledge of pumps was, and in fact, to a large extent, is still practical and divorced from the theoretical mathematical description that somebody like Euler was interested in from the theoretical mechanics. And the analytical mechanics, which Euler developed, has an intellectual history, which essentially comes from the ancient Greek mathematical science of statics, so of computing equilibrium, based on such concepts as Archimedes' principle of the lever and so on. And in the 17th century, this science of statics was formalized and generalized into what modernly we teach to students as the principle of virtual work for finding equilibria. And then in the 18th century, D'Alembert first extended this principle of virtual work in order to compute dynamics of systems which were not necessarily in an equilibrium state, by incorporating the forces of inertia, right? According to Newton's second law, the force is equal to the rate of change of momentum with respect to time. And then Euler and Lagrange reformulated D'Alembert's principle, taking forces to be minus the gradient of some potential function, some potential energy, as a function of the positions of the elements in the system. And when you do that, you can get the equations of motion for the system from the Lagrangian function, which is the kinetic energy minus the potential energy, in this form. And then later in the 19th century, Hamilton reinterprets the Euler-Lagrange equation in terms of an optimization problem here. So he reduces mechanics to an optimization problem by showing that you get the Euler-Lagrange equation from the principle that the action for a trajectory be extremized in the actual trajectory that the classical system follows. But so you see that that this modern analytical mechanics, which we still teach as essentially the last word in mechanics, derives very much from the problem of finding equilibrium, so from the ancient science of statics. On the other hand, there's an idea that has been rattling down the centuries, especially in Europe, about whether it might be possible to design a machine that doesn't have an equilibrium configuration. And this idea goes by the name of perpetual motion. So this, for instance, is a proposal for a perpetual motion wheel due to the Marquess of Worcester in 1655 in England. So this is a wheel with an inner and an outer rim. And there are, I believe, 40 weights. The weights hang from two chains. One chain is connected to a peg in the outer rim and the other one to a peg in the inner rim. And the idea is that these chains are arranged so that all of the weights on the right-hand side of the wheel hang from the chain connected to the outer rim, whereas the ones on the left-hand side hang from the chain connected to the inner rim. And then the idea is that this would mean that the center of mass of the whole system is always displaced towards the right. And then, as drawn, the wheel would keep turning clockwise without ever finding an equilibrium. And then you could use this turning in order to do something useful, like racing water. Now, so it's a bit of a challenge. It's not totally trivial to understand why this doesn't work in terms of the forces and the torques exerted by the individual weights. But you might not worry about that too much, because modernly we know for certain that such a device cannot work, that a device powered entirely by gravity cannot do work in a cyclical way. So there's no such thing as a gravity-powered engine. And the reason is that gravity is certainly a conservative force, so it can be very easily expressed as minus the gradient of a potential function. And then if you try to compute the amount of work that gravity does on the engine, given some initial and final configuration, so the work is the line integral of f dot displacement ds. And by the fundamental theorem of calculus, if the force has this form, then the work is just given by the difference between the potential evaluated at the final point and the potential evaluated at the initial point. So if the transformation is a closed path, so all the weights return to their original position, then initial position and final position are the same, and therefore the work done must be exactly zero. So all of the kinetic energy that is gained as a weight accelerates downwards under the action of gravity must be lost when you lift it back up to its original position. So there's no such thing as a gravity-powered engine. But this question of perpetual motion, as you will see, it has been fruitful in various respects, and it will play a central role in Carnot's own thinking about the problem of heat engines. So I just mentioned this nice quote from Borges. It says that well, I won't read the whole thing, but essentially that perpetual motion might be interesting, even though we know that it doesn't actually work in real life. And just to emphasize the point that I don't think I'm being unfair to Euler when I say that he probably really was not in a position to make a useful contribution to Frederick's project of building the fountain. Let me quote from one of his letters. But before that, let me just mention that Euler's first teacher, from whom he originally learned math, was one of the Bernoullis, Johann Bernoulli, who was also from Basel. And Johann Bernoulli was a great friend of Leibniz, and throughout his life remained an enemy of Newton. So he had some rather unorthodox ideas about physics. And one of the things that Johann Bernoulli was convinced of was that there had to be some kind of perpetual motion, in the sense that I described earlier, because otherwise he could not see how you could explain how in nature we see, for instance, the winds or water or living matter circulating and going around more than once in a closed path. And this is from a letter that Euler wrote to Alexis Clairaut, important French mathematical scientist. This letter is from 1742, so it's already well after the death of Newton. Newton died in 1727, if I'm not mistaken. And Euler is saying, I can't conceive how a movement can occur where there is no equilibrium state. Based on this, there have been attempts up to now to demonstrate the impossibility of perpetual motion, but in the absence of an equilibrium, perpetual motion seems to me undeniable. Could one not invent such a machine using various forces such as gravity, springs, magnetism, etc., so that there is no equilibrium? The famous machine of Porphyrius is surely known to you, as it was much discussed and no one ever discovered any fraud. So Euler in 1742 is still insisting, or at least suggesting, that there might be such a thing as a system with no equilibrium, and that this would be a perpetual motion. And he's even saying that he believes that some person, this guy Orpheus, had actually built such a machine sometime earlier. So, okay, I won't go into all the details about Orpheus. I wrote about this some years ago. I'll give you the reference in a moment. But Orpheus was a German inventor from the early 18th century who claimed, so he demonstrated several different devices that he claimed were perpetual motion devices driven only by gravity. All of the secret of the device is hidden inside of this wheel, so the wheel is covered so that people will not be able to see the internal workings of the machine without paying for the invention. But the idea here is that as this wheel turns, something inside of it is shifting in such a way that it doesn't find an equilibrium. And then here the wheel is shown turning an Archimedean screw in order to raise water against gravity, doing useful work. So the details of this are quite murky, but I think most people nowadays would agree that there was some sort of trick involved. And so this is an article that I published some years ago on the subject for the American Journal of Physics, in case any of you are curious. And this is from a drawing circulated by a mining engineer at the time who claimed that what was going on was something like this, that really there was a hidden mechanism inside one of the supports, and that some guy in an adjacent room was toiling away in order to keep the wheel turning. Uh, this is probably something, almost certainly something like this was going on, but the details of the various demonstrations and so on are still being debated by by people who revisit this episode. But let me just stop now to drive home one point, which will be, I think, important later on. So once we see this, we no longer regard the operation of this wheel as any kind of mystery, because we accept that a person, human being, as a living creature, can exert what I will call an active force. So a person can drive an engine. So a living creature can move in a repetitive way, such that after all the elements of the person have returned to the original position, some net positive amount of work has been done in turning the wheel. Uh, I will call this an active force. So an active force is evidently not conservative. It cannot be written as the gradient of any kind of potential function. And the thing is, we're very used to not even trying to describe the action of something like a human being in terms of the same mathematical, mechanical laws that we applied to something like the wheel and to gravity. But if we did, if we tried to extend mechanics to include the action of this person, then we would be faced with a conundrum. So how does this exert this active force that does net positive work in a cyclical way? And so I've been talking for a while, and I still haven't gotten to our title character of Carnot. So just before moving on to the next section of the talk, let me just briefly describe or define two terms which will be very important for the rest of the discussion, just to make sure that we're on the same page, which are equilibrium and reversibility. So in thermodynamics, when we say that something is in equilibrium, some system is in equilibrium, what we mean is that the system is not changing macroscopically as long as I don't externally perturb it. So for instance, the air in this room is basically in equilibrium, because if I don't do something to it, I don't see a change macroscopically. But if I looked out the window at the atmosphere, clearly that's not an equilibrium, because even though I'm not perturbing it, it's macroscopically doing things. So clouds are moving across the sky, winds are blowing, etc. Okay, so that's equilibrium. Then the concept of reversibility is very closely connected. So this is a famous demonstration of a surprisingly reversible transformation. So what's happening here is that we have an inner cylinder, a solid inner cylinder, and a hollow outer cylinder, and the space in between them is filled with glycerin, so very viscous fluid. And then we've put in the glycerin blobs of food coloring, and then we're turning the crank connected to the inner cylinder. So it looks like we're mixing the food dye into the glycerin. But this transformation is actually reversible. It's reversible because at any given point, if I stop turning the crank, the fluid will not do anything macroscopically. It will stop. So it's at any given point it's in equilibrium, or we're very close to being in equilibrium, because if I stop perturbing it by turning the crank, then it doesn't not do anything macroscopically. And then therefore what this means is if I turn the crank backwards, so if I reverse the turning of the crank, then I undo all of the macroscopic fluid motion, and therefore I undo this apparent mixing of the food dye into the glycerin. So these concepts of equilibrium and reversibility are very closely related to each other. But as I said, there are many things in life, in nature, that are not in equilibrium. And I would classify systems out of equilibrium into two main branches. The first one I'm calling a passive disequilibrium. This is less interesting, but much better understood theoretically. So schematically here, what we have in modern thermodynamic terms, I have matter at high free energy in one place and matter at low free energy in another place. So then spontaneously there will be a flow of matter from high free energy to low free energy, and that flow of matter can push through a load and dissipate energy into heat, generate entropy. But this only generates entropy. This doesn't generate any work. And in such a passive system, there will never be any closed circulation of matter. Matter has to begin at high free energy and end up at low free energy. You cannot close the path. But then there's this much more interesting family of devices, which I will call active devices, involving what I have before called an engine. Again, we have a spontaneous flow from high free energy to low free energy, but that flow can be harnessed in order to drive what is here schematically shown as a turbine. And that turbine can keep turning as long as there's this spontaneous flow, and it can be used to drive a pump. And this pump then can drive a flow of matter in a closed circuit, even against some load. And here the circulation is also written as an EMF or electromotive force, because I believe that this is really what we need to do in order to describe something like the flow of electrical current in a closed circuit connected to a battery. There has to be some pumping mechanism inside of the battery that is giving us this closed current. Okay, so here's a title character, Sadi Carnot. In the Feynman lectures, Feynman introduces him by saying that the science of thermodynamics began with an analysis by the great engineer Sadi Carnot of the problem of how to build the best and most efficient engine. He means heat engine, which we'll say more in a moment. And this constitutes one of the few famous cases in which engineering has contributed fundamentally to physical theory. Because it's quite an interesting story. So Sadi Carnot is one of the more enigmatical figures in the history of all of physics, the entire history of physics. We really know quite little about him, despite the fact that he came from an extremely distinguished family. So let me say a little bit about his life. So Carnot was born on the 1st of June of 1796, so a little bit more than 230 years ago, at the Palace of the Petit Luxembourg in central Paris. So Petit Luxembourg is today houses the offices of the president of the French Senate. But the reason why Sadi Carnot was born here is that his father, so this is a portrait of Sadi around the age of 10, his father, his name was Lazare Carnot, was a very important figure. So he was an engineer, mathematician, an army officer. He's known even today in French as Le Grand Carnot, so the Great Carnot, l'organisateur de la victoire, the organizer of victory, because he raised and organized the armies that defended the French Republic in the immediate aftermath of the French Revolution against the various European monarchies that wanted to destroy it. And in 1796, Lazare was one of the 5 members of the directory that composed the chief executive of the French Republic in the immediate aftermath of the overthrow and execution of Robespierre. And Lazare, the father, was also a founder of a very important institution, the École Polytechnique, known in French by the letter X, so the letter X, X Polytechnique. And this institution had been established in 1794 jointly with Gaspard Monge, important mathematician. I learned about Monge in high school. I had to take technical drawing. Monge invented the orthogonal projections that are still the basis of modern technical drawing. But the École Polytechnique was established as a school for military engineers, but it quickly became also a center of the mathematical sciences in France. And I'll have a bit more to say about this in a moment. Sadi Carnot's mother, her maiden name was Dupont, and she came from a wealthy and conservative family in Saint-Omer in northern France, near the border of Belgium. Now, some of you might be curious about the rather unusual name of Sadi. And this is also an interesting story in its own right. So Sadi refers to a medieval Persian poet, Sadi of Shiraz, who had become popular with French Enlightenment figures like Diderot and Voltaire. And I'm very convinced that the fact that Lazare named his eldest surviving son Sadi was connected with the campaigns to de-Christianize France, which marked some of the early stages of the French Revolution. So Sadi is, of course, not a Christian name. And this seems supported by the fact, it was documented later by historians, that a bit more than a month after his birth, the young Sadi was baptized clandestinely in a Catholic church by his maternal grandfather. And he was christened with the name Nicolas Lénard Dupont. And so he was given the Christian names Nicolas Lénard. And at the time, the baptismal registry lists his father as being somebody who was actually, in fact, his maternal uncle. So his mother's brother. So he was listed under the surname Dupont. So evidently, the maternal family, which, as I said, was much more conservative and Catholic, was not happy about the fact that he had been given a non-Christian name. And even though nowadays, if you look at Wikipedia or many other sources, you'll find Carnot's full name given as Nicolas Lénard Sadi. It's been documented by, especially by a historian that I'll cite more in more detail in a moment, that in all the official documents and personal papers from his own lifetime, Carnot is listed with only the given name Sadi, no other names. But after Sadi Carnot was dead, his younger brother, who was later quite a significant politician in France, so I believe he was the deputy of the National Assembly and Minister of Education, among other positions, and also the father of somebody also named Sadi Carnot, who eventually became president of the French Republic and was assassinated by an anarchist. But so his younger brother Hippolyte insisted on identifying his late older brother as Nicolas Lénard Sadi Carnot in order, I believe this was in order to disguise the fact that his father, Lazare, who he idolized, had given his eldest surviving son a non-Christian name. Okay, so Carnot, Sadi Carnot, was educated at home by his father Lazare, who must have given him a very solid education in mathematical sciences, which Lazare was a great expert. And he finished his schooling at the Lycée Charlemagne in Paris before being admitted at the age of 16 to the École Polytechnique. This is a very famous portrait of Sadi Carnot at the age of 16 as a cadet in the École Polytechnique. So still nowadays, alumni of the École Polytechnique are identified in this way as X and then the year in which they were admitted. So Sadi Carnot was X 1812. He was admitted with the rank 24 out of 179, which is, it's good, but it's not first rank, considering that his father was one of the founders of the institution. And if you look at the list of teachers at the École Polytechnique at this time, you'll see some very, very identifiable names. Ampère, Poisson, Arago, the creator of the Paris Observatory, Gay-Lussac, France still, the ideal gas law is known as the Gay-Lussac law. Dulong and Petit, who established a very well-known law about specific heats. And he graduated in 1914 with a rank, which is again good, but not first rank, 10 out of 65. And he became an officer in the engineering corps of the French army, which is to this day known as Les Génies, in 1814. And again, this connection between engine and engineering and cleverness and genius. And then he was trained in artillery at the military school of Metz from 1814 to 1817. But there was a debate. So when Carnot was a student at the École Polytechnique, there was a great debate about the teaching of mechanics. So let me just read this quote from an article written later by a disciple of Monge, where he says that Monge wanted mechanics to be taught by an engineer because the mechanics of engines, the only one that is useful to engineers, is very much different from celestial mechanics. Whereas Laplace, the very great mathematical physicist Laplace, great expert in celestial mechanics, wished that analysis and mechanics be taught by the same instructor as he regarded mechanics as an application of analysis, as modernly we would say, of calculus. So there was, and this must have had, I'm sure that this must have had a great influence on the development of Carnot's thinking, that the mechanics, the mathematical mechanics that was being taught, in fact, Carnot's professor of mechanics was Poisson. Uh, those of you who have recently taken analytical mechanics will remember Poisson brackets. And I think Poisson was appointed on the strength of Laplace's recommendation to this position. But celestial mechanics is entirely controlled by gravity, and gravity is absolutely a conservative force. So the scheme, the analytical scheme built by Euler and Lagrange and their successors was extremely fruitful in celestial mechanics, but it's not useful at all to the science, what Olivier here calls the mechanics of machines, or I would emphasize specifically, especially the problem of engines. So devices that do positive work in a cyclical way cannot be treated in this way. But I guess the trouble was that by this point, engineers had just become too accustomed to the fact that the mathematical mechanics that was being taught just was not applicable to the practical problems that they had to deal with as engineers. Mm. So they had become accustomed to this divorce between mathematical mechanics and the mechanics of machines or of engines. But I'm sure that this is something that must have preoccupied Carnot's thinking. So Carnot published a single scientific work during his entire life. This was an essay published in June of 1824. This is the title page in French. So translating the title, it would be Reflections on the Motive Power of Fire and on the Machines Fitted to Develop that Power. 600 copies of this were printed. They were all paid for by Carnot himself. So Carnot was financially independent because he had inherited quite a bit of money, especially from his maternal family, from the Duponts. So he didn't have to really work for a living, and he could afford to pay for the printing of this work. It's a little bit, you might notice, a little bit odd that the title is Motive Power of Fire. It's more natural to see the motive power of heat. But I read somewhere that this was because at the time, the standard term in French for a steam engine, which was really what Carnot was interested in understanding better, was a pompe à feu, which literally would be a fire pump. This work did not immediately drop into oblivion because it was presented by an engineer and mathematician called Pierre-Simon Girard to the Academy of Sciences in Paris, and Girard also wrote a brief mention, commentary on it in the Revue Encyclopédique. And we also know that a chemist called Nicolas Clément, who was teaching at one of the academic institutions in Paris, the Conservatoire National des Arts et Métiers, mentioned Carnot's work positively in his lectures in 1825. But immediately after that, nobody else paid any attention to this work again during Carnot's lifetime. So I said that the title in this work, the Reflections on the Motive Power of Fire, pointed towards the fact that Carnot's main interest was what in French would be called pompe à feu, fire pumps, which now we would call steam engines. And Carnot mentions this. He begins by talking about the development of steam engines in England, and a bit unusually for an officer of the French army at the time, he gives all of the credit for the development of steam engines to the English nation. But all these people that he mentioned were practical, self-educated engineers who had no contact whatsoever with the university or really with mathematical mechanics. I believe most of them had just an elementary school education. So there had been a very great practical development of steam engines in the 18th century, mostly in England, where, as Carnot pointed out, they were the most used because they were they acquired great practical importance in mining, but there was no theory of how they worked. There was no rational theory of steam engines, as Carnot himself put it. And this is what Carnot was mostly concerned with. Let me just mention that in 1803, the first steam locomotive had been developed by a man named Richard Tripithick from Cornwall in England. So this is a coin that came out in 2004 to mark the 200th anniversary of the development of this first steam locomotive. All right, so this work, which I'll try to comment, whose contents I'll try to comment on in a moment, really attracted no further attention in Carnot's own lifetime, and he never published anything else. And really, from here, Carnot's career takes very much a downward turn. So his military career had been blighted by the fact that his father had been Napoleon's last minister of war, and after Napoleon was defeated for the last time at Waterloo, so Lassalle had to exile himself to Germany, and then under the new regime in France, the Bourbon Restoration, the Carnots, of course, were politically suspect. This seems to have very much limited Carnot's chances of advancement as a military officer. And in any case, in 1828, he quit the army altogether. In 1828, he was 32 years old, and he was very far from having the requisite years of service in order to qualify for a pension. This was not a huge problem because, as I said, he was financially independent, so he didn't really need to work for a living. But this period of his life doesn't seem to have been a happy one. In an entry in a directory of alumni of the École Polytechnique, he lists his employment as a maker of steam engines, but we have no evidence that he actually did any practical work along these directions, any evidence of patents or even ideas for patents or for investments in the practical development of engines. And this is the last of the portraits that we have of Sadi Carnot by an otherwise unknown artist, Despois. And this historian, Birenbaud, who looked at the life of Carnot in the late 20th century, in the 1970s, says that in this portrait shows the face of a tired man of a restless gaze in which mental equilibrium is no longer assured. In any case, we know that on the 3rd of August of 1832, Carnot was interned in a psychiatric asylum in a suburb of Paris in Ivry. So it was an asylum run by Dr. Skirol. According to Birenbaud, this asylum was popular with, it often took members of the wealthier families who had mental problems. And the documents that we have list Carnot's diagnosis at the time as being mania. It's not absolutely clear what that would mean in modern psychiatric nomenclature. But 3 weeks later, 3 weeks after being interned into this asylum, Carnot died, still in the asylum. He died on the 24th of August. And officially, his cause of death was listed as cholera, but it seems very suspicious that he would have died in the asylum. And Carnot's brother, Hippolyte, who, as we said earlier, would go on to an important political career in France, destroyed most of Sadi's papers, and he tried as far as he could to disguise the fact that he had died in Ivry, so that people would not make the connection with the psychiatric asylum of Dr. Skirol. So I think it is the most likely interpretation is that Carnot committed suicide in the asylum, and this was. It was not in the interest either of his family or of the doctor who ran the asylum for this to be widely known. And so this is where there was a concerted effort to hide this fact. And this historian, Birenbaugh, in an article written in 1974, he says that rarely has a great family made such efforts to place one of their own beyond the reach of the lights of history. So I think this is really what makes Carnot such an enigmatic figure to us now. It's the fact that we know so little about the development of his thought, and we're basically never going to know anymore because the papers that would have clarified this were destroyed by Hippolyte, so they just don't exist anymore. Uh, so this is really I would say it's worse than a tragic end. It's really a humiliating end. People often mention that 1832 was also the year of the death of Évariste Galois. Galois had made some seminal contributions to mathematics before he was killed in a duel at the age of only 20. And the death of Galois, I would call tragic, but the death of Carnot seems worse than tragic, certainly. In any case, so he died completely unknown. But a couple of years after his death, another graduate of the École Polytechnique, Émile Clapeyron, rediscovered his essay. So he had a hard time following Carnot's arguments, but he realized how important they were, and he decided that he could do a better job of explaining them to to a scientific community, and therefore he published this work with a very similar title to Carnot's own work. So it's Memoir on the Motive Power of Heat. So he says chaleur, heat, instead of feu for fire. And in 1845, a man called William Thomson, who is now known as Lord Kelvin because some decades later he was ennobled by the British monarch and given this title of Lord Kelvin. Kelvin is actually the name of a river in Scotland. His surname was Thomson. So at the time, it was just known as William Thomson. And he was visiting the lab of Regnault in Paris. Regnault did a lot of work on measuring the specific heats of gases. And while he was there, he ran into this memoir of Clapeyron. And again, he was struck by the importance of this work. And in fact, he published several commentaries on this work. And in the first few ones, he mentions that he has not been able to find a copy of Carnot's original book, and therefore that he's working entirely from the version of the arguments that he finds in Clapeyron. But finally, some years later, he was able to find a copy of Carnot's original book. And Thomson used this Carnot's analysis to do, well, first one very important thing was just to define an absolute temperature scale. So this is the source of the unit that we now call Kelvin. And he also published his own explanation of Carnot's work. So this is where there's a Kelvin statement of the second law of thermodynamics, sometimes also known as the Kelvin-Planck statement. And independently, in 1850, a German, Rudolf Clausius, reformulated Carnot's analysis in terms consistent with conservation of energy and the equivalence between heat and work. As we'll say in a moment, when Carnot published this essay, like the great majority of the scientific community in France, he believed that heat was some sort of fluid, some sort of subtle fluid that naturally passed from bodies at higher temperatures to bodies at lower temperatures. But by 1850, it had become clear that heat is a kind of motion. It's some disordered motion of the microscopic constituents of matter, and that you can interconvert between heat and mechanical work in a way that respected the law of conservation of energy. And in 1865, Clausius uses Carnot's analysis again in order to define the concept of entropy, which will be of enormous importance for the development of thermodynamics. So if you look at the work of Clausius in 1865, he states what we now call the first and second law of thermodynamics. This is the original in German, so in translation, that would be the first law is that the energy of the world is constant, and the second law is that the entropy of the world tends towards a maximum. And here, this is a nice quote from Eddington, where he says that he believes the second law, the law that entropy always increases, to hold the supreme position among the laws of nature. Okay, so moving on to what I've called Carnot's artifice. So what was the cleverness? What was the great ingenuity of Carnot? And how was he able to basically establish or create the science of thermodynamics without any understanding of the nature, of the microscopic nature of heat. So the main result in Carnot's essay is what we now call the Carnot cycle, which, uh, assuming that those of you who have followed the talk up to now will have already studied in a course in thermodynamics. So the Carnot cycle is composed of four steps. So first, there's a cylinder that contains a gas, and that cylinder is closed by a piston. So in the first step, heat goes into the working gas, but at a constant temperature. This isothermal expansion. The piston recedes. Then I want to reduce the temperature of the gas, but for reasons that I'll have more to say on, I want to reduce the temperature of the gas in a way that does not involve any exchange of heat between the gas and anything else. So this is the adiabatic expansion that lowers the temperature from TH to TL. And then, take this back for a second. Then the next phase is the compression of the gas at this lower temperature TL. And then finally, in order to be able to close the cycle, I need to return the gas to its original temperature. And I do this by an adiabatic compression. So this diagrams, which we now always teach in thermodynamics, this were actually introduced by Clapeyron in his own explanation of Carnot's work. Carnot said all of this basically in words. So this is a cycle, so you can keep doing this over and over again, and then some amount of net amount of work, which is equal to the area contained inside of the cycle, in either P versus V or T versus S, is done. So this is a heat engine. And as you hopefully have learned in thermodynamics, Carnot shows that this cycle has an efficiency, where efficiency means the total amount of work done over one cycle divided by the total amount of heat that goes into the working substance, and that this efficiency is given entirely by the two temperatures, the hotter temperature TH and the colder temperature TL, and that the greater that temperature difference is, the closer that efficiency will get to one, just highest it can be is one, because these temperatures are all positive numbers. And the reason why this efficiency has to be less than one is that we want this to be a cyclical process. And in some of the better textbooks, for instance, Fermi's beautiful lectures on thermodynamics I believe from the 1930s, he emphasizes that there's no limit to the efficiency of the first step of the isothermal expansion. So in practice, there will always be some leakage of heat and some friction between the piston and the walls of the cylinder, but you can make those as small as you want. So in principle, all of the heat that is consumed during this phase can be turned into the mechanical work of the piston being pushed out by the expansion of the gas. But the thing is, we want the piston to come back to its original position. So at some point, we're going to have to push it back into the cylinder. And if we did that against the gas at the same temperature as during this expansion phase, then all of the work that we gained during the expansion would be consumed during the compression. So the trick is to push against gas at a lower temperature. So this means that that it's easier to compress the gas, and therefore that not all of the work that was gained during the expansion will be consumed during the compression. And I emphasize that this is something that is not always taught properly. So this is another guy who was also a graduate of the École Polytechnique, Philippe Le Corbeil. And in this paper from 1936, he says that as a student, he was confused about why there had to be this limit to the efficiency of conversion of heat into work, until later he realized that it comes from wanting to change energy from zero frequency, from the energy of the heat, which has no frequency, to the periodic motion of the engine, of the heat engine. So he talks about the frequency of the piston and the flywheel, which are normally parts of an autonomous heat engine. And so what is Carnot's actual argument? So having read his original essay, I think it's something that most theoretical physicists today don't do. It's something that Feynman did do, as you can clearly see in the Feynman lectures. So what was Carnot's original argument? So he draws an analogy with a water wheel. So in a water wheel, there's a current of water that falls from an upper to a lower reservoir, and this fall of water can move the wheel and perform some amount of useful work cyclically as the wheel turns. So analogously, what Carnot says is caloric, French the calorique, so this what they thought was this fluid, this subtle fluid that corresponded to heat, falls naturally from a reservoir at a higher temperature to a reservoir at a lower temperature. And as it does this fall of the calorique can drive some cyclical process that does a net amount of work. And the key thing about the Carnot cycle in the way that Carnot conceived and described it is that it is reversible. So all the parts of the device are always infinitesimally close to being in equilibrium. So this means that you can run it in reverse. So instead of a fall of calorique generating some amount of work, you can give the device the same amount of work, and this will raise a certain amount of calorique from the reservoir at the lower temperature to the reservoir at the upper temperature. This is what we would now call a refrigerator. Okay, so then Carnot says, imagine that there is some other device, whatever, it can be anything, that is more efficient than this cycle, this Carnot cycle that I've just introduced. If that were the case, then that same fall of calorique would generate the work generated by the Carnot cycle, W, plus some additional W prime. So then I could take W and use it to run the Carnot cycle in reverse as a refrigerator. And then all of the calorique that fell to drive this other engine would be restored to its original reservoir by the action of this Carnot cycle in reverse, this Carnot refrigerator. Then there would be no net consumption of calorique, but there would be some net amount of work W prime produced. And this, he says, seems absurd. This would be a perpetual motion. So we must assume that this is not possible, and therefore that the Carnot cycle has the highest possible efficiency of any heat engine operating between temperatures T2 and T1. Now, this argument was based on this idea of caloric heat as some kind of caloric fluid, by analogy to the flow of water in a water wheel. So the same amount of water hits the wheel on the top and is then released at the bottom of the wheel. But Carnot's private notes showed that he eventually changed his mind. So these are some of the few papers that Hippolyte's brother did not destroy. And many years later, many years after Carnot's death, they were published, I believe, by one of his nephews. And they show that by the spring of 1832, so the year in which he died, Carnot had come to accept that heat was some kind of motion, and that any amount of mechanical motion could be turned into heat by friction, and therefore there had to be some equivalence between the measurement of heat in calories and the measurement of mechanical work. And well, this day it would be, now it would be in joules, but in the day was how many kilograms could be raised over 1 meter against the action of gravity, an acceleration little g. And his estimate was that 1 kilocalorie was about 370 kilograms times meter times g. The modern value is actually 427 kilograms times meters times g. So, it was in the right ballpark. And in fact, Carnot proposes experiments in order to measure this value more precisely, which are very similar to the experiments that Joule later performed successfully, totally independently. And some historians have suggested that the fact that Carnot abandoned the theory of the caloric that he had held to when he wrote his essay in 1824 uh, probably led to uncertainty in his mind about how much of his analysis was valid. His previous analysis was valid, and this might have affected his state of mind. And it turns out, in fact, as Kelvin and Clausius showed later, that Carnot's reasoning essentially survives the abandonment of the caloric theory and the establishment of the law of conservation of energy. And in fact, if you read Clausius's early work, so in the diagrams that I showed a moment ago, I wrote this fall of calorique. I marked it with the letter S, capital S. Modernly, we would use the letter capital S to describe entropy. And in fact, you can think of this argument in terms of entropy S, and it's essentially correct because uh, and this is how Clausius and why Clausius proposed entropy originally. So it's a quantity that is conserved by reversible processes. So since Carnot's cycle is reversible, the same amount of entropy S goes into the cycle from the hot reservoir as is rejected uh, into the colder reservoir, and then irreversible process increase the amount of S. And in fact, if you look at Carnot's original essay, he usually when he first refers to a flow of calorique, a flow of caloric, he uses a letter S. He also uses some other letters later on, but probably Clausius introduced the now universal use of the letter capital S for entropy because he was trying to reinterpret Carnot's flow of calorique in a way that would be compatible with what had been learned about the nature of heat later on. Some people have also suggested that the capital letter S might be a hidden tribute to Sadi, his very unusual given name that Carnot had. And let me also mention it because I think it's worth stressing, and this is often not taught in thermodynamics in university, that Carnot has this. So Carnot was fundamentally interested in understanding how to improve steam engines. So in a rational theory of the steam engine technology that had been booming so much, particularly in Britain in the previous decades. So after describing the cycle, he considers what would happen if the cycle were run between a temperature that's slightly above the boiling point of water, capital T, and a temperature slightly below the boiling point of water, T minus delta T, so for a small delta T. So here the working substance is water. And here are two isotherms, the isotherm for capital T and the isotherm for capital T minus delta T, where we have water that can be in either liquid or vapor phase. So as long as we have both, the pressure is constant. But when we run out of, so when all of the water is liquid, then the isotherm becomes much steeper. And then when we have pure vapor, then the isotherm takes this form. So inside of this region, right, it's where we have coexistence of both liquid and vapor. Outside of this parabolic region, we have either all liquid or all vapor. So it was already understood at the time that the amount of heat that is required to evaporate an amount of water is proportional to the total mass of water that is being evaporated times some constant quantity, which we call the latent heat of evaporation of water, L. So in this cycle, the volume change of the water is delta V, which I can write as the volume of the water in gas phase minus the volume of the course of the same mass of water, but in liquid phase, so Vg minus Vl. So and now I want to make a Carnot cycle, so I close this isotherms with adiabats, And if the delta T is small enough, then this area is almost a rectangle, and this is the work inside of this rectangle is the area inside of the rectangle is the work that is being done during the cycle, delta P times this delta V, and that has to be equal to the efficiency of the cycle multiplied by the heat input, the heat needed to vaporize the water. And we know that the efficiency of the Carnot cycle is the difference in the two temperatures divided by the higher temperature, so delta T over T, and the Q in is L times M. So with just a bit of rearranging, I get this relation, which Carnot says in words. He doesn't write this out algebraically, among other reasons, because at the time he didn't have this absolute temperature scale, which Kelvin later introduced precisely to clarify Carnot's argument. But he says all of this, something equivalent to this in words. But so the algebraic formulation was then due to Clapeyron and Clausius. So this is why this is now known in textbooks as the Clausius-Clapeyron equation. But it's really, as Feynman says, because Feynman evidently did read Carnot's original essay, Feynman had a surprisingly keen interest in the history of science for modern theoretical physicists. So Feynman points out that this is really due to Carnot. And the story is that so the future Lord Kelvin, William Thomson, read this in Carnot's essay, and he realized that the same analysis could be applied to other discontinuous phase transitions. So Carnot had done this for the evaporation of water, but other discontinuous phase transitions should admit this and the same argument. And in particular, he realized that since water has the unusual property that the liquid phase is denser than the solid phase, this would mean that if you took ice and subjected it to a high pressure, then the temperature at which the ice melts should decrease, following the same analysis. And this is something that nobody had thought of or even conceived of looking for. But William Thomson and his brother, who was also a physicist, James Thomson, I believe he was a professor at Belfast, looked for this experimentally and found that Carnot's prediction was correct. And then shortly afterwards, Kelvin says, the future Lord Kelvin says in an article that nothing in the whole range of natural philosophy is more remarkable than the establishment of general laws by such a process of reasoning. So what's so incredible here is that Carnot had come to this conclusion without any knowledge of what heat was, without any knowledge of what phase transition was, without any assumptions about the structure of matter, simply from the idea that whatever a phase transition and discontinuous phase transition is, it should not allow you to build a perpetual motion device by using it. And before moving on to the last part of my talk, I would like to mention another aspect of Carnot's work, which I think is less appreciated than it should be. So when we teach thermodynamics now, I'm sure, so this was the experience that I had, I'm sure many other students have had a similar experience. It's a bit puzzling why we begin by going into such detail about this Carnot cycle, even though, for starters, it's not even something that runs on its own, right? The way that it's formulated, somebody has to be taking the cylinder filled with gas and putting it first on top of the hot reservoir, then on an insulator, then on the cold reservoir, then again on an insulator, and so on. So there has to be some external agent that is driving this process. And it seems a bit arbitrary, right? It's not like you can go into Home Depot and buy a Carnot cycle. So why are we spending all of this time at the very beginning of the course of thermodynamics on this sort of random operation? Of course, the reason is because it leads to this result that then becomes the basis of the second law of thermodynamics. But a few years ago, I learned from Bob Jaffe, who was writing a book on the physics of energy, that Kerry Emanuel is a meteorologist at MIT. realize some time ago that there is an instance of an important instance of a naturally occurring Carnot cycle, which is the hurricane. Of course, the hurricane is not reversible, but the main steps involved in the hurricane are the same as in the Carnot cycle. So first, what happens is that air blows on top of the tropical ocean, and then it absorbs heat from the ocean by evaporation. So some amount of water from the ocean evaporates into the wind that is blowing, and so this is an isothermal heating. Then the air rises very quickly in the inner wall of the hurricane. So from sea level to about 15 kilometers above sea level. And since air is a very poor conductor of heat, you can take this process to be essentially an adiabatic expansion. And so to give some round numbers, we're taking the temperature in the surface of the ocean to be 27 Celsius, which would be 300 Kelvin, and the temperature in the upper atmosphere to be minus 73 Celsius, which would be 200 Kelvin. And then, this air begins rejecting heat into the upper atmosphere, partly by condensation of water vapor, partly by radiation into space. So this is essentially an isothermal cooling, and then it descends from D to A, and this you can take as an adiabatic compression. So with those numbers, the efficiency of the cycle comes out to be 1/3. Now, the isothermal the isothermal heating in this case, so it's not reversible, unlike in the Carnot cycle, because it involves this evaporation of water. But it's easy to find how much heat can be injected into the air by this process. So let me not do all the algebra in detail. Let me just say that if you use the value for the vapor pressure of water at 27 degrees Celsius and 1 atmosphere of pressure, you can, and then the ideal gas law, then you can conclude that the maximum amount of vapor that 1 kilogram of air can hold at that temperature and at that pressure is 21.6 grams. So there can be at most 21.6 grams of water vapor in 1 kilogram of air under those conditions. So that would correspond to 100% relative humidity. So if this were the case, if air were already saturated with water vapor at the beginning of the cycle, then it couldn't absorb any more water vapor, and there would be no hurricane. For reasons that are not well understood, the trade winds, when they reach the tropical oceans and the areas that tend to spawn hurricanes, they're undersaturated with humidity, so they have usually a relative humidity of about 75%. So this means that they can absorb from the surface of the tropical ocean 25% of that 21.6 grams. And then you multiply that by the latent heat of evaporation of water, and you get that the maximum amount of heat that can flow into 1 kilogram of air during this heating phase is 12.2 kilojoules. Then the work output is the efficiency, which you said was 1/3 for those temperatures, multiplied by this heat in. And then you put that equal to the maximum kinetic energy that can be developed by the wind. And you get a maximum wind speed of 325 kilometers per hour, which is in the right ballpark for the highest sustained wind speeds that are observed in hurricanes. Of course, usually wind speeds are much lower than this, but these are the highest wind speeds that are sustained wind speeds that are seen in hurricanes. So again, I remember that Gil Rafael, who is now a professor at Caltech, physics professor at Caltech, but some time ago he was the TA, the course that I was taking on statistical mechanics, and I remember him saying to the class that thermodynamics is saying something without knowing anything. Of course, he meant saying something useful without knowing anything about the detailed microscopic dynamics of the process. So in this case, we can say something quite useful without any detailed understanding of what's actually happening in the hurricane, just from some basic principles of thermodynamics. And one last thing that I would like to emphasize, because it's something that I've been giving a lot of thought to recently. So Carnot says over and over again in his essay that one of the great principles of how to build a heat engine is that all change of temperature which is not due to a change of volume of the bodies can only be a useless reestablishment of equilibrium in the caloric. The necessary condition for the maximum, meaning for the maximum efficiency of a heat engine, is that in the bodies employed to realize the motive power of heat, there should not occur any change of temperature which may not be due to a change of volume. So in the Carnot cycle, heat is only injected or rejected from the working substance at fixed temperature. The changes of temperature are caused by adiabatic expansion or adiabatic compression of the working substance. Or, in other words, that there should not be any contact between bodies of sensitively different temperatures. Of course, this also means that the Carnot cycle is infinitely slow, as Carnot himself points out, because since there is only an infinitesimal difference in temperature between the reservoir and the working substance, then the rate at which heat flows between the reservoir and the working substance is also infinitesimal, so it's very close to zero. So a really reversible Carnot cycle would be infinitely slow. So it would produce work over a full cycle, but since the cycle takes an extremely long amount of time, the power would be zero. So this takes me to something that surprised me when I first had to teach thermodynamics and teach thermodynamic cycles, which is how does a steam turbine work? And this is textbooks describe the cycle for the steam turbine as the Rankine cycle. And I had thought, as I'm sure most people who have not studied thermodynamics would have thought, that you just need to take water into the boiler to make steam. The steam moves the turbine, and then you need to recondense that steam in order to get back the water. And then you just need to, in order to close the cycle, you just need to transport the water from the condenser back to the boiler and keep doing this. If you did that, if you just did that, if you just took the water out of the condenser and transported it to the boiler without compression, then you would actually have zero work output, rigorously zero work. So this would be a completely useless waste of fuel if you did that. It's very easy to see this in the P versus V diagram, because if you did not have this compression in between 1 and 2, then you would just go back and forth along the same isobar, along the same constant pressure transformation. So you need to raise the pressure of the liquid water between the condenser and the boiler, and that means that there is some increase in the temperature from 1 to 2, which is not due to any exchange of heat. It's just due to a mechanical compression of the water. If you didn't do that, you would have no cycle, or you wouldn't have a useful cycle. You wouldn't have an engine. You would do no network. So all of the heat that you consume in the boiler would be released in the condenser, and therefore no useful work would result. But there is one thing that has been bothering me for a while, and I'm not absolutely sure that I know what the answer is, but I suspect that I do, and I have an inkling of what the solution is. Notice that in this cycle, most of the increase of temperature is between 2 and 3. So not all, but most of the temperature increase is due to the injection of heat in the boiler. And Carnot says that increasing the temperature of the working substance by injecting heat is a complete loss. He says it's a useless reestablishment of equilibrium in the caloric. So does this mean that this Rankine cycle is highly wasteful, because most of the increase in temperature is not due to this adiabatic compression, but rather to the injection of heat in the boiler? I think that the real answer to that is that a real cycle is not reversible, and therefore it doesn't take an infinite amount of time. A real engine has to, do its work in finite time. And then this heat that is being injected between steps 2 and 3 is not having enough, it's not being given enough time to thermalize completely. And this is why it's not completely wasted, because some of the energy is actually uh, being used to move the turbine without before it has a chance to just go into the random thermal motion of the water molecules. Um, but this is something that would be beyond Carnot's analysis, because real cycles are not reversible. Real cycles are irreversible, and therefore, in fact, you really cannot even draw an irreversible cycle in either of these diagrams, because the temperature, entropy, pressure, and volume for the whole working substance are not properly defined out of equilibrium. Let me return to that in a moment. Okay, but since I taught this very recently in thermodynamics, let me just mention this, that a nuclear power plant is a Rankine cycle. So what actually generates electricity is the turning of a turbine by a flow of steam. It's just that the steam comes from the steam generator, where the heat input comes from the nuclear reactor. So what the nuclear fission is doing is heating this water, which then in turn heats the this other stream of water, this outer stream of water that passes through a steam generator. So the nuclear reaction is basically just a source of heat for the Rankine cycle. So the steam moves the turbine that drives the electrical generator, and then it's condensed by water from this cooling tower, which is recognized from The Simpsons or any other uh, you know this depiction of a nuclear power plant. And then that condensed water is pumped back into the steam generator. So this pump here is absolutely an essential part of the thermodynamic cycle. Without this pump, without the compression, the mechanical compression of the liquid water by that pump, there would be no work output, no useful energy would come out of this power plant, and then the nuclear fuel would be completely wasted. This other pump here has no such thermodynamic role. This other pump is just keeping the circulation of water through the nuclear reactor in order to extract the heat and then generates the steam. All right, and then how does Clausius ultimately use the Carnot cycle in order to arrive at the second law of thermodynamics in something like its modern formulation? This is an argument that I very much enjoy teaching. I'm going to do this quickly, assuming that is largely familiar to you already. But I've I call this the rule of Clausius and the infernal machine argument. Well, it's Clausius. So what Clausius is really interested in is this arbitrary cycle A, in which various amounts of heat either flow into A or out of A at various points. So this is why there's this index I, because there are many possible steps in the cycle. And if Q sub I is positive, it's because that's heat flow into A, and if it's negative, it's because it's heat flowing out. And then the total net work output of the cycle is written as W sub A. So now Carnot adds a large number of imaginary Carnot cycles to this in order to create what I call the infernal machine. So now I imagine that this Qi is coming from this imaginary or abstract um, heat bath at temperature T sub I. And then I imagine that same heat, before it passes through this reservoir at temperature T sub I, has been provided by a Carnot cycle. So here the way that the arrows are drawn this Qi is positive, the corresponding Carnot cycle C sub I is acting as a refrigerator, but you could have a negative Q sub I, in which case the C sub I would be running as an engine. Sorry. And then, of course, you need to, in order to have a Carnot cycle, you need to also have another heat bath. Now I'm taking the same heat bath for all of the cycles and fixing its temperature at T sub 0, and then the heat that flows between the reservoir at T0 and Carnot cycle C sub I write as Q sub I, comma 0, and the work output of the ith Carnot cycle is W sub I. Okay, so that's the complete machine. So the net effect of this complicated composite infernal machine is to extract some amount of energy from the reservoir at fixed temperature T0 and to turn it into work, which is that amount of work is W sub A plus all of the W sub I's. And then the Kelvin-Planck statement of the second law of thermodynamics is that no cyclical process can have as its only net result the transformation of some amount of energy extracted from a single heat bath at a fixed temperature into work. So this net amount of work has to be negative or zero. It cannot be positive. And then by Carnot's theorem, you can relate Q sub I to Q sub I comma 0 in terms of the temperatures of the two baths, and you get that relation. And then since T sub 0 is a positive number because it's in this absolute scale of Kelvin, then the sum of Q sub I over T sub I has to be non-positive. You could, if the cycle is reversible, you can do the same argument, reversing the signs of all of the Q's and W's. And then you conclude that the sum of minus Q sub I over T sub I is non-positive. And the only way in which those two inequalities can be fulfilled is if that sum is actually 0. But that's if it's reversible. If it's reversible, this is 0. But if it's not reversible, then you still have this inequality. And then that leads, so in the continuous limit where you take infinitely many infinitesimally small heat exchanges, each at its own temperature, this becomes a statement that this quantity sigma, which is minus the integral of infinitesimal heat exchange delta Q over temperature T, has to be non-negative. For reversible processes, it's 0. And then, therefore, for reversible processes, we can define this delta Q over T as exact differential ds. So an exact differential must integrate to 0 over a closed transformation. And then you can define entropy as a state variable, but only for things that are in equilibrium, for equilibrium states. Because, as I said, if a transformation is reversible, then each intermediate state must be in equilibrium or infinitesimally close to equilibrium. So the difference between the entropy of two equilibrium states A and B can be evaluated as the integral over any reversible transformation from initial state A to final state B of delta Q over T. Okay, and as I hope all of you will know, this eventually, this quantity, this entropy that was introduced in this way by Clausius, is interpreted statistically, mostly by Boltzmann. So this is, I believe this was actually written in this form by Planck after Boltzmann, but the idea comes from Boltzmann. This is the modern statistical interpretation of entropy for, this is for the microcanonical ensemble. All the microstates are equally likely. You can modernly define an entropy for any ensemble according to this formula introduced by Gibbs and then used for the entropy of information by Shannon. Shannon, incidentally, is the other engineer that Feynman mentions as having made fundamental contribution to theoretical physics. Incidentally, Boltzmann also killed himself. As I said, I'm almost sure Carnot did. In Boltzmann's case, there's no question. But as you can see from the dates, Boltzmann died at the age of 62. So no, it's not as tragic as the situation with Carnot, who died at the age of 36, if I remember correctly. Okay, so I've been going on for a while. It's normally not good policy to talk for more than an hour, but this, I'm going to upload this to my YouTube channel. And if people are interested, they'll listen to it, and if they are not interested, they won't. But okay, so what do I think can be learned from all of this? Why am I, as a theoretical physicist, interested in this story? Okay, so I've been teaching cosmology recently, using textbook by David Bauman, and he quotes this in the section of discussion on the primordial density perturbations from inflation. There's a famous remark by the theoretical physicist Sidney Coleman, professor at Harvard. This is from the lectures that he gave there in the 1970s in quantum field theory, and he says the career of a young theoretical physicist consists of treating the harmonic oscillator in ever increasing levels of abstraction. Sure, I've repeated this in jest, but recent years have come more and more to feel that this is certainly not something to brag about, and it might not even be something to joke about. This is really a tragic situation where the development of the academic practice of research in theoretical physics is such that the last thing that a young theoretician wants to do, if he or she wants to succeed in the academic career, is to sit down and think deeply about important, difficult questions, open questions in science. What you want to do is to publish the largest possible number of papers and to get the largest possible number of citations as quickly as possible in order to advance up the academic ladder. So this creates a very strong incentive to just move along lines that have already been established in where there are already existing academic communities. And this is a disaster. I think this is the reason why so little real progress has been made in theoretical physics in the last several decades, despite the hugely increased number of people working in the area and the hugely increased investment in terms of money in this research. So I would very much like to not go in this direction of considering the harmonic oscillator in an increasing level of abstraction. What I would like to do is to think about engines. A harmonic oscillator is not an engine. A harmonic oscillator does exactly zero work over a complete cycle of its motion. So some positive amount of work is done when the mass is moving out, and then some negative amount of work is done when it's moving in. They cancel out exactly. So thermodynamics, beginning with Carnot and as developed by other great figures in the 19th and early 20th century, was a theory of heat engines. So in fact, what Carnot was worried about was that there was this hugely important technical development in steam engines that was completely disconnected from theoretical physics. It was driven entirely by practical people trying out what worked and what didn't work. And what Carnot wanted was to have some kind of rational understanding of the principles necessary to design and build heat engines. So the thermodynamics that grows out of Carnot's work is, to a large extent, a theory of heat engines, but it is never a theory about how they behave in time. So in classical thermodynamics, you never consider the time dependence of anything. You never write down time as a variable. It's all about relating various thermodynamic observables between them, and often only in equilibrium, which of course is very much an abstraction because real heat engines must operate in a finite amount of time and must therefore operate irreversibly. And what I'm most interested at the moment is in better understanding how how far back you have to step in the development of thermodynamics in order to really introduce this equilibrium. So how much of what we learn in thermodynamics is really specifically about equilibrium, and how much can be extended to non-equilibrium situations? So we normally begin by writing down the first law of thermodynamics in this differential form. The deltas are inexact differentials, and the d's are exact differentials, as you know. Usually we immediately we merely consider a homogeneous fluid as the working substance, and then we write down this infinitesimal work delta W as PdV, pressure times the infinitesimal change in volume. But this tends to obscure the fact that the very concept of work comes from Newtonian dynamics. So work was defined as force dotted with displacement. And the fact that this is an exact differential that can integrate to something non-zero over a full cycle means that F is not conservative, so it's not the gradient of anything. It's not going to be the gradient of anything, but friction or viscosity, they are not conservative, but they do negative work, and they don't change the equilibrium, the mechanical equilibrium of a system. But this, in an engine, this has to be what I call an active force, so a non-conservative force that does positive amount of work over a full cycle. I think an equally good name for the active force would be a pumping force. So this is really a pumping dynamics, and it's a dynamics in time. And this is the thing that has always been missing from mechanics. And this goes back, as I emphasized, to Euler. So Euler, who could not fit an actual pump into the scheme for analytical mechanics, the best that he could do was to introduce this fiction of an imaginary column of water whose weight pushed down on this piston in order to quantify the necessary force of the piston in this way. But that's not so Euler did not have a realistic description of the pumping force. He only had a kind of energy budget of how much work you needed to get from the pump in order to move water up to a certain height. So really, a realistic description of active or pumping forces is quite beyond the scope of analytical mechanics. Moreover, so normally we also write this delta Q, this infinitesimal heat, as T times ds, but as I emphasized by going over this infernal machine argument of Clausius, S is only a state function in equilibrium. So if you have a process out of equilibrium, an engine operating in finite time, you should not write heat as TdS. And this is not how you usually get to equations of state in thermodynamics textbook, but this is how Gibbs did it, which I think is the most instructive way of considering it, which is by integrating the first law of motion, the first law of thermodynamics, in terms of the extensive variables V, S, and the quantities of matter N, I. And then the equilibrium states of some substance are characterized by this function U, V, S, and I, which Gibbs called the fundamental relation. And then you can obtain all of the properties, all the equilibrium properties of the substance from this. And in particular, you can get from this the equation of state for the substance. But then you can do this only in equilibrium. And there's a question about how far can you use equations of state, which are strictly speaking valid only in equilibrium, for things that are varying in time. And so I think many people realize that non-equilibrium thermodynamics is important in order to describe the real world. And there has been a development in this field, which mostly can be traced back to the work of Lars Onsager in the 1930s. But all of this work frames the problem in terms of currents and forces that are gradients of thermodynamic potential. So they're not gradients of mechanical potential, but the gradient of thermodynamic potential. So it still has the same problem that you cannot describe active forces or pumping forces or currents that flow along closed circuits in this language. So I think really this kind of approach that Onsager framed can be applied to passively irreversible processes, but not to actively irreversible processes. And often what happens here is that a little bit like in Euler's treatment of the hydraulic pump, even though you don't have a realistic description of the pumping, you can still get a budget for how much work is needed in order to raise water up to a certain height, just by an argument of conservation. So in this kind of Ansagerian framework, what happens is that you often assume that the system has reached its steady state, so that the same amount of power that is being pumped into the system is being passively dissipated in the load, and then you can compute the total amount of energy dissipated, and you make that equal to the pumping power, but you still don't have a realistic description of the pumping dynamics. So there's all the difference in the world between Ohm's law and how the battery actually generates the electromotive force that produces the power that is then dissipated in the steady state in the resistor. All right, and in the 1960s, 1970s, Prigogine and his collaborators tried to extend Onsager's analysis, which was based on linear response theory, into the nonlinear regime. And with this, they claimed for a while to have arrived at a general theory of dissipative structures, for which Prigogine even won the Nobel Prize in chemistry. But I think nowadays most physicists would agree that this was not a general theory at all. In fact, its results are only useful in a very narrow set of circumstances. But I think the problem remains the same. The problem is that there's no dynamics of pumping, in the same sense in which there was no dynamics of pumping in Euler's mind, because of this straitjacket, this mental straitjacket of analytical mechanics. And there was at least one person who was a very great critic of this approach to non-equilibrium thermodynamics. In fact, he called it Onsagerism. He says because these disciples should not be allowed to claim non-equilibrium thermodynamics for this particular approach. And this was Clifford Truesdell, who I think spent most of his career at Johns Hopkins University. And Truesdell so he advocated for a different approach, which he called rational thermodynamics. Unfortunately, what Truesdell wanted was, he says this explicitly at various places, was a mathematical theory of the same sort, the same level as what he regarded as the great achievement of Euler and of Cauchy. Cauchy was, among other things, the father of continuum mechanics. You know about Cauchy's stress tensor and so on. So this is really what he wanted. And I think the trouble was that, so Truesdell recognized, I think, that this approach of Onsager and Prigogine and others could not really describe what I would term active processes. But Truesdell was still, working within this mental straitjacket, I think, inherited from analytical mechanics. And as far as I have been able to puzzle out the constructive part of Truesdell's proposal, I think he makes two very serious mistakes. And one of them is to try to use equations of state locally outside of equilibrium. And the other problem, I won't go into this at all now, is that he insists on the frame independence of thermal properties, which I think is actually impossible. So thermal quantities cannot be frame dependent in the sense that mechanical quantities are in Galilean or special or general relativity. But this is a topic for another day. In any case, my point is that there are some very strong critics of this Onsager approach to non-equilibrium thermodynamics, but they have not managed to produce something more constructive. And so I've been at this for a while, but I would still like to present this little argument, because I'm quite proud of it, about this I think points to when do equations of state fail, and how is it that they fail in an actual engine, in an engine that operates in finite time. So the setup here is the usual one. So I have a cylinder filled with an ideal gas closed by a piston. A is the cross section of the cylinder. The position of the piston is marked by X. There's an external pressure, fixed pressure P0. So when the pressure of the gas inside is equal to P0, the piston is at equilibrium. This will correspond to a position X0 and therefore to a volume of the gas V0. If I apply the ideal gas law, I get this. Now I just consider small, sufficiently small displacements of the piston so that I can do the Taylor expansion to first order and get a linear force acting on the piston. But now I'm going to take the temperature to be not constant, but rather varying in time. So the temperature will vary around an average value, a fixed average value T bar, which is also the temperature of the ideal gas when it is when the piston is in equilibrium. So when pressure of the gas is equal to P0. And now let me consider the force acting on the piston as as the temperature of the gas varies. And then I combine this with Newton's second law of motion, and I get this. So I will now consider a particular form of the variation of the temperature. I'll take the temperature to oscillate sinusoidally. So the amplitude of the oscillation will be delta t, and the angular frequency of the oscillation of the temperature will be little gamma. So now I just transform this equation, write this equation in terms of the displacement with respect to equilibrium of the piston, delta, and I get this. And this is a material equation. Well, usually the material equation doesn't have this right-hand side, but adding this is not a big deal. And you can show rigorously that this equation has parametric resonances when this frequency of the oscillation of the temperature is sufficiently close to an integer submultiple of the natural frequency of the simple harmonic motion that you would have if the temperature of the gas were fixed at T bar. Now, if you do that, if you vary the temperature with a frequency that causes a parametric resonance, then the amplitude of the motion of the piston would start growing exponentially with time. But this would be a violation of the laws of thermodynamics because over a full cycle of the oscillation of the temperature, you don't have, so the same amount of heat flows in as then flows out, and the same amount of positive work is done when the piston is moving one way as is consumed when it's moving the other way. So over a full cycle, there's no net consumption of either work or heat. And yet, this equation predicts that you would have this parametric resonances if you vary the temperature with the right frequency. Notice also that this kind of setup would be totally the contradiction of the principle of Carnot that in an engine the heat should not go into varying the temperature of the working substance. That any heat that goes into varying the temperature of working substance is, according to him, a waste. So here, all the heat is going into varying the temperature, and if I assume that the ideal gas law is valid, I'm getting an engine which violates the principles of thermodynamics. What this means is that if I assume that the laws of thermodynamics hold, then the ideal gas law must fail when the temperature of the gas is varying sufficiently quickly. And the scale of time is given by the first of these parametric resonances. So the first of these parametric resonances would come, it's related to this frequency of the simple harmonic oscillator. But then what is, I think that this admits a very intuitive and hopefully fruitful interpretation, which is that the gas must not be thermalizing So, and therefore must be staying away from the regime in which the ideal gas law is valid if uh, if the piston is moving with a frequency that is faster than this time scale, because then the motion of the piston itself would be preventing the molecules of the gas from thermalizing. Because what happens is that if the molecules of gas are hitting the piston is taking away with it some significant amount of the energy, and that energy is then not available to thermalize in the gas. So that energy cannot go into the molecular chaos uh, that Boltzmann uses in order to arrive at the equilibrium properties, including the equation of state. In this case, the ideal gas law. So it's really the motion of the piston that is preventing the energy from thermalizing inside of the gas. And to the extent that you allow the energy to thermalize into the gas, to the extent that the energy is going into this molecular chaos, you stop having an engine, and you go into the regime of equilibrium. So I think this already gives you a sliver of light to the direction in which one must go in order to have a statistics of how an engine actually works in finite time. But this is really something that needs to be much further developed. And let me, yeah, so I'm drawing to a close finally. It's been almost 2 hours. This is a diagram that has appeared now several times in my work with collaborators, especially Robert Delitsky and David Gilvasser. I think this is the first time that this showed up. And the idea here was to have a simple model of an autonomous heat engine, so of an engine that worked in finite time on its own without requiring some external intervention in order to modulate the coupling of the working substance to the heat baths. And here this is done, this is represented by the motion of the piston controlling these valves, and these valves in turn control the coupling of the working substance to the thermal baths. And as I explain in various places in my work, so with collaborators, in order for this to work as an engine and be compatible with the laws of thermodynamics, what needs to happen is that when the piston moves, in this case, as drawn towards the right, so as x becomes larger and the working fluid expands, so this would, if this were an adiabatic reversible transformation, this expansion would cause the temperature of the working substance to decrease. So when that happens, when the working substance is expanded, we want less heat to come in from the hot bath and more heat to go out into the cold bath. So this valve one is closing and this valve two is opening, and vice versa. When X becomes negative and the gas is compressed, we want less heat to be rejected into the cold bath and more heat to come in from the hot bath. This, in words, this was formulated a long time ago by Rayleigh. This is called the Rayleigh criterion for thermoacoustic oscillations. So what Rayleigh says is, ordinary, boring, passive things, when say a bit of air is compressed, then the temperature goes up and it loses more heat to the environment, and vice versa. When it's expanded, temperature drops and then it gains more heat from the environment. This just causes damping of the oscillation. The oscillation dies away. But if you could reverse that, if you could have it take in more heat when it's compressed and reject more heat when it's expanded, then you could have that heat flow encourage the oscillation, and then you would get a self-sustained thermoacoustic oscillation. But anyway, this was also something that was, so this equation that I show here was written by Eddington in a different context, the context of the oscillation of Cepheid variable stars in astrophysics. In any case, this is also something that I've been thinking about for a while. There's a theory, a purely kinematical or mathematical theory about self-oscillators. So self-oscillators are things that maintain periodic motion at the expense of a source of power that doesn't have any corresponding frequency. So this is not a resonance. But then this is something like an engine. But the theory of self-oscillations, which begins with Airy and Rayleigh and Poincaré in the 19th century and was followed up by van der Pol, Hopf, and Dronov and others in the 20th century, is, as it exists, is basically a branch of the applied mathematics of the theory of ordinary differential equations. But the way in which this oscillations, the mechanisms that sustain these oscillations are unphysical in the mathematical literature. So, for instance, van der Pol equation uses a linear anti-damping term. Airy used a delayed action term where the force depends not on the position of the piston now, but on its position a little while ago. And Le Corbusier, who I already mentioned earlier, X 1910, was interested in this. He was a friend of van der Pol, and he says that at one point he had a conversation with Charles Fabry, famous for the Fabry-Perot cavity in interferometry and optics. And Fabry said that somebody should make an effort to connect this kinematical theory with the thermodynamics of motors, thermodynamical theory. And this was something that Le Corbusier talked about and proposed in the 1930s and the 1940s, but that didn't really advance terribly far for some of the reasons that I think I've been trying to get at in this discussion. That somehow neither the analytical mechanics that we get from Euler nor the thermodynamics that we get from Carnot was really adequate to dealing with this problem. So I would say that there's really very much a blind spot, a theoretical blind spot surrounding the irreversible dynamics in time of active processes, of active irreversible processes. Okay, so it's been 2 hours. Sorry for this. I really was hoping to get through this a little bit quicker. But what are the main ideas that I really want to communicate with this long spiel? The first one I would say is that there's a reason why Carnot is such an unusual and unique figure in the history of theoretical physics. So it's not only that he was an engineer, it's not only that he published a single work in his entire life and then died in very sad circumstances at the age of only 36, I believe. Carnot's work is essentially the only standard result in all of theoretical physics as we teach it to undergraduates, to physics majors. It's the only standard result that transcends analytical mechanics, that lies outside of the scheme of analytical mechanics. And the reason for this is that Carnot was, his concern was to understand something about heat engines. And engines in general, which are devices that manage to do positive work in a cyclical way, cannot be described by analytical mechanics. And unfortunately, right, he was not able to connect this to dynamics in time. And finally, the Carnot cycle in which his thinking is based is infinitely slow, so it has no active force and delivers zero power. But it's still a very significant starting point because it's really the only place in the standard physics curriculum where you come face to face with this problem of engines and the fact that they're not treatable by the tools of analytical mechanics. And this is a problem not just about heat engines. So Carnot did this because he was interested in steam engines, and steam engines are heat engines. But this is a problem that extends to other kinds of engines, other kinds of devices that do work cyclically and must also be thermodynamically irreversible. So this problem is greater than, broader than just heat engines. Now, there is still a quite active field of research in non-equilibrium thermodynamics, but it is based mostly on the scheme originally proposed by Unseger in the 1930s, which I think is proper to describing what I have called passive irreversible processes, but not active processes, because what it is missing, what is fundamentally missing, is a realistic dynamics of pumping. And as I tried to say, this problem of not realistically describing pumping and only sort of accounting for the energy consumed by the pump in terms of some fictitious device is something that is present already in the very early work of Euler, and is manifested in the failure of Euler's contribution to the project of building the fountain at Frederick the Great's palace in Sanssouci. I think that there are many. So in the case, for instance, of the hydraulic pump, so even though Euler was not able to realistically describe the action of the hydraulic pump in terms of his analytical mechanics, he could still see that something was actually happening in time that was causing that pumping. I think there are many other active systems of interest in which the pumping dynamics is not obvious to the naked eye, and in which it has remained invisible to theorists. I would say that the clearest example of this is the battery. And I don't have time now to go into this, but I've published some work in this with collaborators, with Robert Olitsky, David Goldwasser, and Liz van Houw, on how charge is pumped inside of a battery. And this turns out to be a problem that was argued about for more than 100 years. So this is a problem that was already there in 1800 when Volta invented the battery. And everybody who was anybody in either physics or chemistry in the 19th century at some point participated in this debate about where was the seat of the electromotive force inside of the battery. And this was a problem that was never really resolved. It's just that in the 20th century, people were tired about this endless arguments about the battery, and there were more interesting things to deal with as theoretical physicists. But the mechanism, the mechanics of the pumping at the electrochemical interface in the battery, I think is still absolutely something that is not properly understood theoretically. And what happens with batteries is the same thing that happened with steam engines in the 18th century, which is that they are perfected by trial and error without a real theoretical control or understanding of the pumping dynamics. And finally, what I would also try to emphasize is that in recent years there has been a lot of interest and a lot of talk about complexity and the science of complexity. A Nobel Prize in Physics was awarded for this a few years ago. It's never been absolutely clear what complexity means, but I think that whatever complexity means is less important than the problem of activity, the problem of describing active systems of pumping. I like to joke about this in class. I've said this a few times to my students, that there's no Lagrangian for the human heart. This is true, but it's not because the heart is complicated, which it is. The heart is very complicated, as are all living systems. But the reason why there's no Lagrangian for it is simply that it is a pump, or an engine, if you want. It's an active system, and you cannot describe active systems, engines, by Lagrangian dynamics. And Feynman says in the Feynman lectures, right, that there's a fundamental, very long-standing problem about circulating fluids, the description of circulating fluids, including turbulence, but not necessarily limited or necessarily requiring turbulence. Even the theory of fully developed convection is not there, and it's not there because convective system is an active system, and it requires the description of a pumping force, and we're still lacking that. And I think this is really what the great obstacle to the development of the theory of biophysics, but also of meteorology. And there are many instances in astrophysics of active systems that cannot be properly described with the tools that we have right now because of this issue. Not necessarily because they're so complicated, but because they're active systems. And this is absolutely the main point that I would very much wish to communicate.